Gravity Commons podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, very excited to be with y'all today.
Maybe by way of introduction, I'm just going to throw questions out and you all can decide who wants to go first, or maybe just one of you take it. But can you just describe how you two know each other, how you met? What's the context of your maybe relationship as authors, but also in person, if there is one?
There very much is an in-person one. We're good friends, and have known each other for about 20 years. Both of us went to graduate school at Union Theological Seminary. And while I was starting my PhD there, Charon was starting her master's, and we both helped to form the precursor of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, the organization both of us now work at. It was called the Poverty Initiative back in those days. And for the past 20 years, our lives have been very intertwined, both building a movement out in the world and going through big personal moments together.
That's awesome. Well, let's talk a bit about your book, We Pray Freedom. Reading some of the promo material on it, and it says that the book of liturgies and rituals that you've curated here was born out of a movement of communities committed to abolishing poverty. Can you talk a bit about these communities, which I think you're referring to, that's referring to the Freedom Church of the Poor, the FCOP. Can you talk a bit about that and your relationship to those communities?
Yeah. So as Liz was mentioning, the Poverty Initiative is the work that we both helped to found, and really draws on an even longer lineage of organizing that helped to found the Poverty Initiative, coming out of homeless organizing among poor and homeless families, welfare rights organizing. And really the book, while it does come out of the Freedom Church of the Poor, that started in 2020, around when the pandemic hit, and we were looking to create an online community where people could meet. And, when folks weren't able to go to maybe traditional communities of faith that they would usually go to, also, folks that maybe already weren't going to a kind of institution of faith, but were looking for a spiritual and political home in that moment. And so we were able to form the Freedom Church of the Poor. But that community that started the Freedom Church of the Poor was really coming together with years and years and decades of organizing. Folks that were organizing, welfare moms in Detroit, or, folks that were doing school to prison pipeline work in Philadelphia, or folks that were organizing for universal health care in Vermont, or farm workers that were organizing in Immokalee, Florida. But, all of that work was years of poor folks organizing and trying to connect movements, recognizing that, their struggle was part of the larger problem that we were seeing, with the kind of economy that has continued to go in a downward slope for most in this country, as well as, just different ways that communities were being torn apart and marginalized in this moment. And folks that were amidst all of that trying to come together and in many ways build, a poor people's campaign that was linking their struggles and building on work like Dr. King and others had tried to do as well, of seeing the intersections of, poverty and racism and war, and, what we also recognize ecological devastation that are impacting community after community. And so those are the folks that are in this book, folks that we've worked with for decades, that are on the front lines of struggle, and looking at how do we continue, as different crises hit our communities, to sustain ourselves? How do we continue to connect with other communities and let others that maybe don't know about our struggles, understand what's happening, and do something and say, this isn't the way it has to be.
Yeah. So can we talk about abolishing poverty for a second? Because several times when I've spoken about this idea of making that we don't have to, the poor we don't have to have among us, right? I get the words of Jesus kind of thrown at me, right? Jesus promised that we'd always have the poor. And so it's, it's inevitable. It's pointless to get rid of it. So have you heard this, like sort of reaction or response to abolishing poverty? And if so, how do you respond to it?
We've heard it like every week of the past 35 years.
Jeez.
In fact, so much that I wrote a book on the very subject, and that Bible passage, kind of reinterpreting it, coming out of all of these conversations and all of this work. But I mean, I loved the way you said it in your kind of your question and your introduction of like that Jesus promises, right, that
Yeah.
the poor will be with you always, that we'll always have poverty here. I mean, I think there are so many ways to deconstruct this. I mean, one is that we have the material capacity to end poverty tomorrow. Um, right now, it takes 45 minutes to build a prefab home. They 3D print houses these days, right? Like with the pipes right in them. We throw out more food in the United States every year than it takes to feed every person that's hungry across the world. Like there is no actual reason um, materially that we have poverty. It's just that we don't have the political will or the moral consciousness to end it, right? And so that hasn't always necessarily been the case. I don't know that that was the case when Jesus walked the earth, but it also is not what he's saying when he makes that statement. I mean, scholars across religion and across time agree that he's actually quoting Deuteronomy 15 when he says this statement.
Yeah.
Which Walter Brueggemann, who passed away this year, but has this beautiful statement about Deuteronomy 15, which is the most radical part of the Bible that nobody knows anything about, right? I mean, it's these Sabbath, these holy prescriptions that say that if society, if the whole nation, cancels debts, pays workers a living wage, lends out money, never knowing that they'll be paid back, if the whole society kind of lifts from the bottom so that everybody can rise, then that's actually what happens, right? That the which is so opposite of the logic of kind of our you know 21st century capitalist system. The notion that actually, if you make sure that you organize society around the needs of the poor, then your whole society flourishes, is so foreign to us. But it's also economically proven to be true. I mean, some of the biblical scholars that we know have actually looked at biblical times and seen that debt cancellation had to happen because it's how society stayed stable. And both Sharon and I live in New York City. When they passed the minimum wage law to raise it to 15 and then 60, and up, people are always decrying, oh my gosh, everything's going to come crashing down. If we actually paid low wage workers something closer to a living wage, all the businesses are going to have to go out of business. I mean, that's not true. That doesn't happen. Actually, when you pay low wage workers more wages, guess what? People spend more money and they buy more things and they pay for ballet lessons for their kids and they keep the bodega across the street going, like actually when people have more money, all of society does better. And so that's what Jesus is talking about in that passage. He's also, critiquing kind of unjust economic systems. Uh, he's also in that moment anointed as Christ, as the Messiah who is supposed to set society right and turn the world upside down and usher in a reign of justice and abundance for all. And so, it tires, I think, really both of us and everyone we know how often that is used, and it's used by folks that are adhering Christians and atheists and everyone in between. But it's used as an excuse, and it's making poor people an excuse for why we haven't built a society where where everybody's in and nobody's out, when we can very well do that.
Yeah, clip it. Clip it. Send it on the socials. I think we settled that, Liz. I really appreciate you sharing that. It's so like one of the things that I notice is that when people use that passage in that way, they're doing the opposite work Jesus was doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we could just stop doing the opposite work Jesus was doing, that would be a good start. Across the board, but
Definitely.
especially with that text. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we got your book title here, Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. We'll make sure that goes in the show notes.
Oh, thanks.
Well, I would love to. You begin your book, and I want to dive into this with anchoring the power of the praying poor with the parable of the persistent widow. Would you unpack it a bit about how is she the example of the empowered poor?
Yeah, I can jump in. As Liz was just talking, though, this is definitely her. She's the biblical scholar of the two of us, so she will do it better justice. But it is a parable that we've used a lot over the years, and it is the parable that Jesus offers, right? When he says, "I'm going to teach you how to pray." And Jesus doesn't say, go to a silent room, get down on your knees and reflect and pray to God, right? Jesus goes and says, I'm going to share this story, right? About this woman who is in tremendous hardship. And she has to go day after day after day to this judge who cares nothing about, right, justice, cares nothing about doing what's right, and is not prepared to even give her justice, right? But what to pray, right, means to Jesus is to keep going, right? You're going to, because justice isn't something that is handed down. It is something that we can demand, right? And that praying is going again and again until she basically wears this judge down, right? And he has to hand over justice only because, like, she's made him do that, right? He had a turn of heart even, right? It may be even that he's even more annoyed. But the justice that comes, like, right, that's what is praying is a delivery of justice when we call out and demand that justice is what Jesus is teaching us in this parable. And it isn't an act it, right? It is actually in taking action. It is not just in silently hoping that this will happen, but it's showing that actually if we continue to kind of go and demand and take action, that we can help deliver the justice that God wishes for us.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think one of the things that your book is full of is rituals. I think that's in the subtitle as well. And I'd love to talk about that a little bit, somewhat, because I think rituals are one of my love languages, maybe. Anyway, anyway, as an Episcopal priest, one of the things I deeply appreciate about our tradition is just the focus on the liturgical acts that we participate in together. But in your book, you contrast rituals of the poor with rituals of empire. And so I think, maybe a lot of our listeners may have, I don't know, who knows what comes into their minds when they think about rituals, but what do you mean by rituals? And then how do you see them functioning? Like, how do they do the work that they do to empower or disempower the poor?
So again, I feel like Charon actually probably should answer this, but I'll start, and then I'm sure she'll be able to.
I like this. You guys are answering each other's questions.
I know, right?
I know. We really are. I love it. Well, I think I think of an example around like a ritual of empire versus a ritual of the poor, and I think about Trump's birthday this year, where there was this big military parade in Washington, D.C., almost foreshadowing the occupation of the Capitol. And there was all of this pomp and all of this circumstance. And it was trying to get people to act in the image of who he sees himself as being, and how a structure that's kind of polarized needs people to act, right? Where we cower in front of the military, where we, show our deference to the people that are in power and can make the decisions over our lives. And then I contrast it with what happened also that day, um, of these thousands of little protests and gatherings and vigils and song circles in towns all across the country, kind of taking away the power of this military parade and putting it into the hands and voices and feet and bodies of regular folks. And we have been traveling around for the last couple of months. We've been in about 50 communities, mostly medium-sized cities and small towns and rural areas. And right around then, I was in Springfield, Illinois, at a kind of a Juneteenth slash No King's Day slash like let's talk about organizing kind of gathering, and 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 not far from where I was in Springfield were a number of towns in Illinois and in Michigan and other places, including also all the way to the south, where these little towns where like half of the people are struggling and half of the people are showing up for the first time in their lives to engage in a ritual of the bottom, right? Of saying like, we live in a society where everybody should have the right to kind of live and live in abundance. And so I think, like, I was thinking about that day in particular, kind of contrasting, these rituals of empire versus these regular everyday people, things who do both regular and extraordinary things all the time. And I think that that's a little bit of what ritual is and does. Liturgy, which is also in the subtitle, means the work of the people. And thinking about just like the things that we do in our lives every day, to make meaning and to build belonging and community, and just to get by, and to have joy and kind of celebration and all of that. And so, I think that this compilation of resources that's in this book, is all of that, right? Um, it's joy and it's sorrow and it's meaning making and it's belonging, and it's also just protesting or standing against the ways that other aspects of society kind of demean and degrade us, like that military parade sought to do, but maybe didn't have success in.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think those two examples. I wonder if we could get specific about some of the rituals, liturgies, and prayers that are in your book. You organize the chapters around the needs for collective remembering, healing, mourning, action, and celebration. Every one of these chapters has a reflection written by one of the authors, followed by a number of rituals or liturgies written by the poor. I wonder if maybe each one of you could pick one of those liturgies or rituals and share a bit about it from your perspective.
Yeah, I think, we were thinking about what are all the ways that communities kind of gather and help to sustain for the long haul, and even what does organizing look like in many ways, right? In that take the form of these kind of rituals and practices. And so, that might be taking action together, which is in chapter 4, but it also might be the need for holding, tremendous grief in a community, or it might be the need to, in the midst of these crises and attacks, how do we celebrate, the accomplishments of our movement? How do we celebrate and claim joy in our movement as well? And so the one ritual I was thinking a little bit about today, and partially both with this idea of like this question of who are the poor that came up in the beginning of the podcast. And also I also organize a lot of artists and cultural organizers, and I'm about to convene a group of folks like that. that are, often poor and struggling artists as well, might not claim that I'm poor, but, and often come into movements as like what they're often described as allies to the movement, or, like asked to come in and support a movement. But there's a ritual in the book that was written by Anu Yadav, and it's a song. Actually, it takes the form of a song, and she's an amazing actress and storyteller. And it's really about her own journey to recognize that she wasn't only an ally of the movement, but as she herself experienced, housing insecurity, health insecurity, like it was other poor folks that she had been, standing alongside as an ally with, that she had helped to organize, food drives and work on housing in DC, and realized like they were the ones coming to her aid, when she herself was experiencing, homelessness, and recognizing like, oh, this is my movement too. I'm part of this. We talk about there being 140 million people that are poor and low income, and that many more of us that are one paycheck away from poverty, one healthcare crisis, one,
Yes.
one paycheck, like, that all these things. And so, she tells her story of that and why it's so important then to be part of this movement, right? And she shares this, beautiful song that was actually written in a collective of artists that have been part of the movement as we were exploring, this idea of revolutionary love. What does revolutionary love look like? How do we celebrate this deep, what Dr. King called agape love? It's not a romantic love, but it's this deep, I am here to help care for like my, our human family and the earth, right? This kind of love that is about justice and is about, being, lifting up kind of these moral values that will transform society, right? And so, the song says, we belong, we belong, we belong, we belong, we belong together. We belong, we belong, we belong, we belong, we belong together. And it goes on to talk about, that out of the mud, the lotus blooms. So out of our struggle, right, that is where the joy of the movement can be birthed, and hearts wide open with the truth. She says, seeking justice, seeking peace, linking arms, we're gonna get free. But it's this idea of only in coming together, right, that we celebrate that joy. We celebrate the possibility of something different, and we can see ourselves in the movement, that we can break the loneliness of the lie of loneliness. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for singing that part of it too. That
Seriously,
really brings it
come
across.
on. You got a
I
great
know, right?
voice. I love it.
Yeah.
It's a great voice.
Liz, is there one you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I guess what comes to my mind is actually a piece around mourning and remembrance. So there's this liturgy about Potter's Field, which is where poor and indigent folks are buried in actually towns and cities across the country. The one in New York City is on Hart Island, which is actually under the purview of the Department of Corrections. And there's close to 1 million people buried there in mass graves. 25 grown-ups, 1,000 babies and little kids to a grave. Um, and we learned about Hart's Island and Potter's Field in New York City when one of the co-founders of a homeless organization in the city called Picture the Homeless actually died and was buried there before any of us knew he had even passed. He passed away on the subway, and his family and his colleagues, didn't know. And we found out through this kind of organizing campaign that that there were no memorial services for all of these folks. This Potter's Field came into the purview a little bit when COVID emerged, because actually they reopened it in a pretty massive way because of all of the death that was happening in New York City. And I think also, I think this is particularly meaningful to me as we're watching this all-out attack on unhoused people across the country, especially in in Washington, D.C. right now. But the liturgy that developed by unhoused folks was in conversation with the biblical story of actually both Potter's Field and of like where the story of communion and Eucharist comes from. You know, actually, when Jesus, you know, at that Last Supper is using this liturgy of, you know, remembering with and sharing stories and with the bread and the wine. Um, it's because that ritual itself was actually coming out of some of the burial associations of poor folk in the Roman Empire. And so Jesus kind of used and popularized, you know, a form of ritual that already was existing. And I find it then, you know, really beautiful to imagine that then every time we serve communion, I'm a Presbyterian pastor, I serve it. Sometimes in the Freedom Church of the Poor, sometimes in different, um, uh, you know, kind of mainline Protestant churches, sometimes at homeless encampments, my own self, and 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 so this liturgy develops where there's kind of the rewriting of the Matthew 28 passage when Judas realizes what he's done and he tries to you know, give back the money and they won't take the money. And so that starts to, you know, be a place where a Potter's Field is this kind of field of blood is uh, you know, remembered and carried on. And but this idea of unhoused people, you know, in the 21st century, um, looking at what unhoused and poor people did 2,000 years before, um, and developing a liturgy that both is in conversation with our biblical text and with the kind of text of people's lives today, I think is really moving, and it makes, you know, communion all the more moving to me, to imagine that we're not just remembering Jesus, um, but we're remembering everyone that has come before, who has been perhaps too poor to die, um, and the dignity that they've been denied in life, they've been denied in death as well, um, and that it doesn't have to be this way. And so that one's really moving to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, something you just referenced, Liz, I want to maybe touch on a little bit because, you know, Ben and I are Episcopal priests. Christy's a local church pastor in Colorado Springs, kind of a non-denominational tradition. But we've got a prayer book, and our prayer book was created kind of as a liturgy for the people, you know, like 500 years ago, right? A long time ago. But our prayer book references things in sort of the real world. There's a prayer for the king, you know, there's a prayer for certain other things. But really, one of the reasons why it's traveled so far is because it lacks a particularity. And something about let's call it your prayer book or the Poor's prayer book, is that it's hyper particular. So one of the things that I was struck with here is that these prayers, these liturgies, these rituals emerge from very particular moments or stories of struggle. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit. That's what makes it most compelling. One of the most compelling things to me is I feel like you're capturing sort of a moment in the struggle, in this artistic or liturgical expression. Maybe you could share a bit. How do you intend, or what would you hope for people who weren't there, who don't understand that particularity? How do we receive this book? What are your hopes on how we receive? And I know use can be a pejorative term, but use this book.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to think about together because, you know, part of the reason we designed the book as it is, with really including the stories of the communities, was for this reason, to really introduce people to one another, right? And to different struggles. And to, as you go through it, they are such a wide, breadth of struggle, to see yourself somewhere in here, right? Or some way to connect, like, and it might be different ones on different days too, but, rather than just kind of put a prayer and ritual book together that was the prayers by themselves, right? We could just have a bunch of, like, a little description and a prayer or a song or a litany, but we really wanted to tell the stories of these communities to really welcome people into meeting the communities that are part of this. And then, the reason for the reflections afterwards was really an invitation to then think about, with your community, how do I connect? Like, are these issues or these, experiences something that I've seen maybe either firsthand, or maybe that might be somewhere near me? And how do I make sense of this moment when I know these kind of, struggles are happening? And so the book really is an invitation, and really is a design to, be read in community, and for communities to collectively kind of think together. You know, they're if you do Bible studies or like any kind of reading group, like, they really are built to, like, hey, let's read this together. Let's, meet this community. We actually have a companion website that will be launched on September 1st as well, where people can find all of the organizations that are referenced. Like, there will be links to websites where you can find out more about different communities. And then there's also, because as you read the book, there's little icons whenever there's something you should go to the website for, like a song, because, you can read the words, but it's something else to experience it by hearing the song and, actually learning multiple versions of it. So you can kind of find, oh, this one might fit best with my community too. We've had different people kind of do different interpretations of songs. And so we really do hope people will use it and also be inspired, whether to share and, like, offer, as you're using a prayer in your community, to say something about the community who it came from, or just to be inspired to say, oh, I can also write a new prayer or a new liturgy, or, for this moment. And I think that's one of the big things too, is we often have, a thought that, oh, there's only, like, so only certain people can write these things, right? But we're saying, actually, like, again, liturgies are the work of the people. Like, we all should be participating in the creation of meaning making in our community. And how do we kind of take on that task to help write the things that we need for this moment?
That's going to be a great resource. We'll make sure to put the link in the show notes so that our listeners can see that. You mentioned the reflections, and sprinkled in your reflections are reminders that poverty is a systemic issue. I think many of us come from religious and political traditions that tend to lay more blame on personal moral failing for poverty than they do on the system. Can you just double click on, just tell us ways in which poverty is a systemic issue for the poor?
Yeah, thank you for that question so much, because we really do believe that poor people are sinners, not that poverty is a sin, like a structural sin that
Yeah.
our society could get rid of.
Yeah.
There might be some forms of sin we can't, but this one, guess what? It doesn't have to be. But I mean, I think a lot of things. I mean, for one, the last census tells us that about 140 million people are poor or won a couple $100 emergency away from absolute economic ruin. I mean, that's close to 40% of the population. And I was reading a couple weeks ago, now 60% of people in this country are saying that they can't really make ends meet. And so even just that breadth and depth says that it's something systemic. It's 140 million people didn't all buy too much of the wrong thing, or have too many kids, or make personal moral choices that were wrong, right? I mean, like, you can't have close to half of the richest country to ever exist people living in some form of poverty and have it be just an individual failing. But then also, when we start to look at actually like what causes and what has caused and what continues to cause poverty. I mean, it's everything from you know the lack of a living wage. I mean, there is not any county, any town, any holler, any city, anywhere in this country, if you are working full time at minimum wage, that you can afford to even rent a 2-bedroom apartment. Now,
Right.
that again is structure. That's a system. That isn't just that you don't want to work or you didn't you you know you squandered your money some way. It's that you're working full time and you still can't afford even just to rent a little apartment for you and your family. Like, um, so there's that level. I mean, the the way that our society deals with the problem of poverty also shows how it's systemic. I mean, in the COVID-19 pandemic, um, there was a whole layering of lots of different social programs because people were hurting. And for a hot minute, everyone wasn't being blamed for not having enough to make ends meet. So you have one little program that's called the child tax credit, right? It's they made it fully refundable and they expanded it a little bit, um, which meant that by making it fully refundable, it meant that you couldn't be too poor to get it. Because actually, many of the different programs that are supposed to lift the load of poverty in the United States, you have to have an income requirement, which means not just that you can't make too much, it's also that you can't make too little. And so, uh, so lots of people, millions of people in in this society actually are too poor to get anti-poverty programs. So that was eliminated for a short time in the pandemic. And what it did is it impacted 40 million people, right? And it took 4 million kids from below the poverty line to above the poverty line. If one program paying a little bit of money, like a couple $100 a month for millions of families, that we can absolutely afford. In fact, like just that one program, it's like one military jet. Like if you just got rid of one, like you could pay to extend and expand the child tax credit for everybody. Um, but 4 million kids went from below the poverty line to above the poverty line. And then guess what? Congress, didn't extend it. And now the even even SNAP, like even food benefits, even Medicaid, even healthcare benefits are under attack, right? So this is another place that you can kind of see that poverty is structured into the very being of our society, including even in the anti-poverty programs supposedly that exist, where we know what it's going to take to actually improve people's lives, and our politicians choose not to do it. And so, I mean, there's so many more, but it's very clear that also in those examples that just like poverty isn't a choice and isn't a moral failing, um, what is a choice is to allow poverty to continue. Um, that our society could make different decisions. Our politicians could actually follow the will of the vast majority of people who believe that we should have a living wage, that we should have universal health care, that we should have public education and free libraries. And if our politicians actually listen to that, then we could make poverty history. We could end and abolish poverty forever. Um, uh, and yet we are not making that choice, and instead spending a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to kind of trample on those that have been already hurt and marginalized by a system and structure of impoverishment.
Thank you for that. It's it kind of makes me sick to my stomach actually as
Yeah.
I hear, because I mean, you throw out numbers, but like I'm actually thinking of names. And I
Yeah.
don't want to say their real name. Let's just call them Larry and Lucy. But like I'm actually thinking of Larry and Lucy, who I know, who's my friend, who literally texted me and was like, "I don't have food."
Yeah.
and I have to wait until Thursday to go to the food bank. You know what I mean? Like it's like real people. It's not just a number.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a logic behind thinking that the best thing for those people is to suffer more so that they will come to a place where they'll work harder to not suffer. Like there's a punitive, retributive logic at work in a lot of the ways that we think about poverty, and it's not only a theological problem, but it's there's also like legislative policy problems as well. I just appreciate the work that both of you are doing, especially giving us access to these precious communities that's doing work that doesn't capture the headlines. People aren't tweeting this out or being invited on some talk show to describe this stuff. And so part of what I appreciated about this is I feel like I need the poor's voice in my life more amplified, because they actually teach me how to be human in ways that those who devour widows' houses cannot. And so thanks for making this so accessible. There's, I don't know, dozens and dozens of liturgies, and we've talked about two. Too many to go into here. But I wonder, quickly, before we go, would you just describe a little bit, both of you work for the same organization. Would you describe that organization, what you do, and how people could find that online if they wanted to?
Yeah, I can start and Liz can pick up, but we work for the Cairo Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice. And we are an organization that for years has been committed to building a broad movement that is working to develop leaders, community and faith leaders, who will build a movement to end poverty. And what that looks like, it takes many forms. We work with, folks like in this book that are doing organizing on the ground. We are regularly out and around the country, meeting with and convening groups to better strengthen our organizing, to connect and build, bigger than we are as individuals or groups, right? Connecting faith communities with grassroots communities. We do a lot of leadership development work. We do a lot of, trying to understand, as we talk about the battle for the Bible and the battle over theology of, what does the Bible really say about these things? What do our faith traditions really say about these things? And what's the word? Surprise. It's not what they're saying among authoritarianism, right? But really it is a call to justice and to take care of everybody in a society where everybody's in and nobody's out, right? We do a lot of work around culture and music because we believe, that people really need that in this moment. Communities are really isolated, are fearful, are struggling, and we need places to be able to come together and to believe and know that there is something else possible. And so we've anchored our work in these kind of cultural practices to be able to lift that up.
Yeah. Well, the book again is called We Pray Freedom, Liturgies and Rituals from the Freedom Church of the Poor. Liz and Charon, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Being here.